I have to confess that I'm not feeling very sharp today. Are you suggesting that...
Yes, the entire history of podcasting has been fortunate. From the Stone Age till now, no real crisis has occurred. We've been very lucky, but if it's all luck, then it has to come to an end one day. Let me tell you, it's ended. Prepare for the worst. Every podcast, Joe Rogan. Welcome to Science Fiction Book Club, a podcast for bookworms and stargazers. In every episode, we dive into the pages of our favorite science fiction novels to break down the big ideas, ask the nerdy questions, and maybe learn a bit about ourselves along the way. My name's Abu.
And I'm Opsa.
And Opsa, we're here to talk about Three Body Problem chapters 4 through 6, as the title indicates.
Episode 2 is here! I'm excited for this one.
Yeah. We're finally getting into more of the story, and I can't wait to talk about it, because we have some big, like capital B, big ideas and themes to get through on today's discussion. But before we get into it, let's take care of some housekeeping. Let's knock this out real quick. Today's discussion will contain spoilers for chapters 4 to 6 of Three Body Problem, so make sure you've done the reading before you continue listening today.
And as always, we encourage you to read along with us and share your thoughts. So email us at sci-fi-bookclubpod@loreparty.com and join our Patreon at patreon.com/sci-fi-bookclubpod. We post free reading guides and discussion questions, as well as bonus clips that you can't find anywhere else. Bloopers, all the best stuff you'll find on Patreon. That's right. It's also where you can find our Discord. Please do join our Discord. Keep the nerdy sci-fi discussions going with fellow readers in the community.
And us, we'll be in there too.
That's right.
And of course, you don't have to jot down all of those links frantically as you're driving. Please focus on the road. All of those links are in the show notes, so you can go find those later. Now, with the housekeeping out of the way, here's the game plan for today's episode. We'll begin by summarizing the chapters from today's reading, 4 through 6. Then we'll share our first impressions and predictions of the story so far. And then finally, we will round out our discussion by diving into our sci-fi analysis and getting into some big themes and ideas. So before we get into all of that, let's take a quick breather, Opsa. But dear listener, don't go anywhere. You're going to want to stick around for this one. We'll be right back in a minute.
Welcome back, listeners, and without any further interruptions, let's jump right into our summary. So at the start of Chapter 4, The Frontiers of Science, we are briefly introduced to Wang Miao, who seems to be a generally skilled and well-to-do engineer working on nanotech. He's caught the attention, though, of a clandestine and mysterious group of military officers, police, and scientists who are investigating the unusual deaths of several top physicists. They want him to use a prior invitation to the Frontiers of Science to serve on their behalf as a mole for them. Many of the dead physicists had contacts with the group, so they suspect some sort of involvement. He eventually agrees after being goaded by the detective that escorted him to the meeting. The chapter ends with some really ominous remarks from General Chang. Yes, the entire history of humankind has been fortunate. From the Stone Age till now, no real crisis has occurred. We've been very lucky, but if it's all luck, then it has to end one day. Let me tell you, it's ended. Prepare for the worst.
Now, in the next chapter, Chapter 5, which is titled A Game of Pool, Wang visits the home of one of the physicists on this list. Yang Dong, he visits her boyfriend's home. And Ding Yi, the boyfriend, is clearly very drunk and has clearly not quite recovered from his girlfriend's tragic demise and is still processing. Ding eventually does explain to Wang what was at the heart of Yang Dong's suicide, why she did it. Apparently, experiments have been occurring in the physicist community that challenge the notion that the laws of physics are invariant across time and space. They do this little pool game thing where Wang shoots the ball into the socket over and over and over again as they move the table around the room, and he successfully does it every time. So seemingly physics is invariant across time and space. Wherever they move the table, physics still applies. But the experiments that these very famous physicists have been doing around the country are showing the opposite, in fact. Random things are happening at random times and random locations, and there seems to be no pattern to it. And this sort of leads to the really tragic conclusion for a physicist that, quote, physics never existed and never can exist, end quote.
Well, we move on from that really gripping chapter into the shooter and the farmer.
Mm-hmm.
We follow Wang Miao as he returns home, and he's trying to settle back into his routines. You know, he grabs his camera, he grabs his bike, hits the town, and is looking to shoot some still photos of his city. But he quickly starts to notice something odd. Every photo has a timestamp that seems to be running down.
Yeah.
It's a timer. And no matter what he tries, he can't stop or explain them. He frantically has his wife and then his child take photos with the camera. Nothing.
Right.
You know, he does all manner of tests and he can't figure it out, can't get to the bottom of it. And soon he's seeing them in his vision, even without the camera. It's very freaky. I don't know what I would do in his shoes. That is... Oh my God, what do you even... Okay, so he eventually reaches out to the person who had first introduced him to the frontiers of science, Shen Yufei, to tell her about what was happening to him. And what she says is the only way that he can stop this phenomena is to shut down his lab. And incredibly, she's right. When he shuts the lab down temporarily for repairs, the countdown immediately stops. So, shocked and shaken, he, of course, confronts Shen Yufei again and says, you know, he won't fall for this trick, despite how impressive it is. And her final remarks stop him dead in his tracks. 3 days from now, that's the 14th, between 1 and 5 in the morning, the entire universe will flicker for you.
My goodness.
And scene.
Does it have to be 1 in the morning? That is so past my bedtime. Yeah. Could we aim for more of like a evening 6 to 8?
Just like just that sweet window, just right before dinner or just after.
You know, what television likes to call prime time? Like, would love a universe flicker.
That's right
before Colbert and right after the 5:30 evening news.
Can I just catch the highlights on Patreon? Do I really have to watch live? Yeah. I mean,
my goodness.
This is fascinating.
It's wild. This chapter with the countdown timer in particular was so cinematic, and I can just imagine how it'll play out in the Netflix show. We're obviously recording this before the show comes out.
Oh, totally. And we're finally, this is, I think, the chapter where we really start to see the sci-fi or the sci, I should say, in this fiction.
Absolutely.
I'm looking forward to more of it, but this is where we're headed. I mean, I'm in for the ride.
Yeah, for sure. Well, what do you think? Chapters 4, 5, and 6, what were your impressions and thoughts on these chapters, and do you have any predictions for where the story might go?
Yeah, I mean, I, needless to say, thought these were great chapters. We got some excellent plot progression, got introduced to some nefarious characters and, you know, the shady people that appear to be investigating them. And yeah, we got a hint of some of that mind-bending science at the heart of this novel. Mm-hmm. So no complaints for me. I mean, there's just, you know, I think there's just so much for us to unpack and really dive into. And but I totally agree. I think there's a lot from these chapters that I think would adapt very well to the big screen. And we've got a lot of really fun characters and emotional centers that can be kind of hit based on the set of chapters. And those dramatic, intense moments, when Wang Miao is basically questioning his sanity. And, just the beginnings of a really gripping mystery is also snuck into this novel in these early chapters. So yeah, I'm totally loving this section so far.
I really liked his visit to the eye doctor, and the doctor was like,
Yeah.
Are you sleeping well? Maybe? Are you hitting like 7 to 8 hours regularly?
Yeah. Any lifestyle stressors, maybe? Yeah.
I know work is crazy right now, man. Same. Same.
Right.
I'm also seeing countdowns in my sleep,
Yeah. He also goes to like the top doctor in Vision for understandable reasons, but I don't even know what you say. I'm seeing numbers countdown. Have you seen that before?
Yeah. It's a dramatic chapter, and I loved it. Well, do you have any predictions though? Where do you think the story's going to go? I know you've read it before a couple of years ago, but any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's great that I have a terrible memory right now because I don't remember really anything that's to come. So I can make predictions, and at the moment, I don't actually have any. I think I do have some open questions in my mind. I'm definitely wondering about Red Coast Space and Wenji, given these chapters take place some 40 years after the first 3 chapters we read. If I have my math right, she should be in her 70s or so now. And you have to wonder, over 40 years, what happened with like the Death Ray satellite or whatever it was, like there's a, and it's also, I think, separately, it seems pretty likely that Wang Miao's experience has some kind of an agent behind it. And they seem to be fucking with him very clearly, for lack of a better way of putting it. So there's definitely a little bit of a mystery around that. No predictions, but I've definitely got my eyes and ears peeled for any clues behind that.
Definitely. I mean, the mystery is slowly unraveling for us, and I think the pieces are starting to fall into place. We've got our main players, our main actors. We've got like some existential threats that's being hinted at, and we've got a mystery of what happened 40 years ago versus what's happening now. And I'm excited to see all of those threads come together.
So, I mean, tell me, Abu, what are you thinking? How are you feeling about these chapters?
I am in the same boat as you. I've been really enjoying the book so far. These chapters in particular, I think the slow burn mystery has been interesting because part of me just is desperate to know what's going on. And I'll admit, I even read a chapter or 2 ahead because I was like, maybe they'll tell me in the next one, and they don't. It's still a mystery. But I remember a couple of years ago when I read this book for the first time and didn't like it that much. I remember being turned off by this like very slow start of the book. Yes. I'm certainly feeling some of that again now, but it's different. Instead of being like turned off and not wanting to keep reading, I'm actually having what is probably the intended effect where I'm really intrigued and I really want to know, so I can't help but read ahead.
Yeah.
And so this time around, I'm definitely enjoying it much more. Now, as for my predictions on what may happen next, again, same as you, I don't recall much of this book from the first time I read it, so a lot of this is fairly new to me. But there are 2 things that I want to call out that seem pretty obvious to me from these chapters. Number 1, it seems very clear to me that the frontiers of science have had or does have some sort of contact with the aliens, the aliens that we know that this book is about. And they're either working with or for this like alien species. I mean, like Shen Yufei and her husband are like hella suspect. I'm like, what are you 2 up to? So the answer has got to be aliens, at least in my mind. So that's my
Yes.
prediction. Frontiers of science connected to the aliens. The other thing that seems pretty clear to me is that the knowledge of these aliens is like super DEFCON 1, like ultra top secret. And like only an inner circle of this like battle group that Wong is invited to even knows what's going on. And so from that, I'm going to go ahead and make the assumption, and I might be wrong, I'm going to make the assumption that most of humanity has no clue what's going on and is utterly ignorant of this alien threat that's either here or that is coming. And it's only a rare few people like General Chang who, like, to our quote from earlier, know how fortunate humanity has been and how shit's about to hit the fan.
Right.
So those are my predictions. Frontiers of science, super shady, related to aliens, and nobody knows about it yet, and humanity might be caught off guard because they're being super secret about it.
Yeah, those feel pretty solid from where I'm sitting. I like those predictions. Shen Yufei and husband, definitely suspect. I will also say Pan Han, who we encounter just as Wang is leaving Shen's house, he does have a little bit of a shady moment there where he appears to be threatening Shen Yufei's husband.
Yes.
So there's ample shadiness to be found
Right.
in the character.
I mean, it's extra shady that they seemingly have all this money. They're like super rich, and Shen Yufei's husband doesn't work and just like plays on his gaming rig all day. Like he goes into VR and plays on his gaming rig all day and doesn't have a day job. There's something going on here.
Right. All right. So we're already diving into a lot of the interesting ideas that we're encountering in the chapter so far, and we've got so much more ahead of us after just the tiniest of ad breaks, and then we'll be right back.
Welcome back, everyone. Let's dive into our sci-fi analysis for these chapters. We each picked a topic or a takeaway to dive a little bit deeper into. And I actually want to start, Opsa, by sharing mine, because I was reading ahead and looking at your notes, and I think my takeaway actually sets up your takeaway very nicely.
Yeah, let's do it.
So for my takeaway, I want to briefly dig a little deeper into this balance between nature and science in the book so far. In particular, I find it really interesting that Wong, who is a well-known nanotech expert, right? He's a capital N nerd, loves photography. And we even spend a whole chapter with him, like, walking around taking photos until obviously the countdown comes into play. There's also, earlier in chapter 4, a flashback to a moment where he comes across Yang Dong, the young woman who died by suicide. He met her a year ago, and the way that section describes her and his sort of infatuation with her and the way he starts to place her within some of his photographs, it's all very interesting, and I want to pick that apart a little bit. But before we get to that, I do want to mention very quickly as an aside, on a meta level, I couldn't help but think about how perhaps Liu Cixin, the author of this book, might be placing a little bit of his own experience in Wong's character a little bit. Because as we discussed in the last episode, we talked about his biography, the author's biography. And Liu worked at a hydropower plant as a software engineer for many years out of college.
That's right.
While he was sort of like moonlighting as like an author, right? He was writing these short stories and novels. And it wasn't until Three Body Problem that his career sort of took off. But from my research, I also learned that even after Three Body Problem took off, and it was seemingly clear that he could make a living off being an author, he still continued to just like work at the power plant and like kept doing his day job for years. I found that interesting. Like, it's clear that
that's super interesting.
A character who works sort of a 9-to-5 day job, that's his profession, also has like a passion on the side. And Wong clearly has that too with photography.
Right. Yeah. Right. What you know. That's interesting.
Okay, so back to my takeaway. I want to start with that moment with Yang Dong, the young woman that he sees, because I love how he first notices her, not for her physical beauty, but actually for the way that she kind of fits into the image that's in front of him. And I loved how his photographer's eye couldn't help but admire this contrast, right? On one side of the quote unquote frame is this giant 3-story heap of metal that's under construction. And then bathed in like a single ray of sunlight is this woman standing there. And the description of this moment alludes to this idea of nature in this novel as well. It says, quote, as though a single flower was blooming in a metal ruin after a violent thunderstorm, end quote. That's how he was seeing Yang Dong in that moment. She was that flower blooming within a metal ruin. She was that nature inside of this man-made thing that didn't last, which I think is a sort of an interesting idea. And I wanted to connect that actually to chapters 1, 2, 3 in our last episode, because this theme of nature has been present in the story all along. It makes me think back to Ye Wenji and the book that Bai Mulin gives her, and how that totally changes her perspective, but also what the book is about. It's about looking at human acts from nature's perspective. And if you do that, human acts can look like atrocities.
Yeah.
And we see this like sort of nature-focused outlook in Wong's character as well, in regard to his photography. This is the quote that we get. Consciously or subconsciously, he usually chose corners of the city that held some aspect of the wild. So he's not out here doing like street photography or architecture photography. He's in Beijing, like a massive city, looking for the nature in it.
Yeah.
Which I found really interesting. So again, this is maybe me digging too deep or seeing things that aren't there, but it seems clear enough to me that there are some sprinklings of an idea in this book so far about this need to respect nature and to find harmony in the way we live with it. And whether or not this will actually come into play as a larger theme later in the story, I don't know, but it certainly caught my attention, and I think it really does tee up and fit into your takeaway and the big idea that we're going to get into next. So I wanted to call it out, that there seems to be a through line of nature versus science, nature versus man-made throughout this book.
Yeah, I totally love that take. Like it really resonates. And I think it's interesting because, and recognizing that Wang and Liu Cixin might be cut from the same cloth, if nothing else, you do have to wonder what Cixin's commentary is here.
Totally.
And for me, I think this is probably a good segue into the broader motif here that stood out to me, which was essentially technology as disease. We've basically been hinting at that, and it's only touched very briefly in these chapters, but it is just such a fascinating theme to explore. In describing Pan Han, perhaps the founder of the pastoral China movement, Cixin writes, he believed that technological progress was a disease in human society. The explosive development of technology was analogous to the growth of cancer cells, and the results would be identical. The exhaustion of all sources of nourishment, the destruction of organs, and the final death of the host body.
Wow.
Pretty harsh take. That's not one to mince his words.
Oh my God.
That's pretty brutal, But you have to wonder, is it completely far-fetched? And maybe he's got a point here. Maybe it is the case that we've destroyed much of our natural habitat. We've done a lot of damage to planet Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, on the other side, to play devil's advocate, technology has also, of course, allowed us to perform what would otherwise be totally miraculous feats. We've eradicated diseases. We are currently exploring space. And of course, most importantly, we have the ability to massively share the spiciest memes over the World Wide Web.
Wow.
But, the question is it possible that the tools of our salvation and advancement as a species will also be our undoing?
Right.
I'm not saying I'm totally down with the eco-terrorist cause at all, but I'm certainly interested in seeing how the threat around Panhan plays out. Is he
Right.
a mere fanatic, or is he a voice of reason in a world gone mad? I'm so curious and so invested, I think.
Yeah, I mean, Oops, I love this takeaway. Like, I saw this in the script and I was like, oh my gosh, I have so many thoughts about this.
Yeah.
This Panhan section of the book, it's only a couple paragraphs, right? It's this little
Right.
takeaway moment in the larger story. It really perked at my ears too, because I was like, there's something going on with this guy. There's more to him than meets the eye.
Yeah.
I think regardless of what it means for the plot of this story, which I hope we will certainly find out, there is that larger question that you're alluding to, this idea of Panhan's view, technology bad, go back to the ways of nature. I'm personally like a big tech nerd, right? I love playing with
Yeah.
new gadgets and gizmos. I love geeking out about stuff like the Apple Vision Pro and seeing the possibilities in it.
Yes.
But the older I get, I do find myself wondering if all of this tech is going to be a net positive for humanity, especially as we all become so plugged in all the time. You and I are perhaps from the last generation that remembers a pre-internet and a post-internet age, right? Like we
Oh,
were
totally.
young enough to have pre-internet, but then we grew into a world that is internet. Every generation after us will never not know what it's like to ask for a Wi-Fi password when you go to a friend's house.
Right.
So I find this really interesting. The more I see how plugged in we all are, the more I begin to question some things. And look, I mean, the spectrum is quite wide, right? Like at one end of the spectrum, you have this like hyper technocrat view of humanity, where the idea is that every problem that we as a species face has a technological solution, and thus all it requires us to do is to create and invent and explore.
Right.
And the example that's sort of the messy example that sort of comes to my mind is this idea that AI could be the solution to global warming, right?
Right.
On the other end of the spectrum, you have like the Han folks who almost have this like, I hesitate to call it like a Luddite view, but like almost Luddite view that technology is bad and that humanity was better off hashtag back in the day. And it would all be much
Right.
better if we just went back to our roots and lived like a quote unquote natural human existence.
Right.
And it's interesting. I don't know where I fall on this spectrum, but I do know that both of these views willfully ignore a lot of nuance there in the conversation, right?
Right.
Like
Right. All the middle ground.
all the middle ground. There's so much more nuance to be had there. Like technology, of course, like you said, has solved countless problems, has allowed us to send dick pics at any hour of the night. Also,
Between
penicillin
1
has
and
saved. But also, modern medicine is effectively just like fucking black magic for someone from 1,000 years ago.
Right.
That's all well and good, but we can't only talk about that while ignoring the like literal existential crises that our technology has also caused for the human race, right? Global warming being a great example.
Yes.
And then on the flip side of it, I would argue that there is no quote unquote natural back in our roots way for humans to live, because we've always, for our entire existence, used technology to survive. At its core, things like farming tools and weapons, sticking a rock to a stick and calling it a spear, that's technology.
Right.
Clothing, right?
Right.
Staying warm in temperatures or staying cool in warmer temperatures. All of that is based off of technology.
Totally.
And so
it's in the definition of our species.
It's the definition of our species. So I think going too far the other way and saying, oh, I need to say no to all technology and quote unquote live some like natural life, I think that's
Right.
also ignoring how crucial technology is to human existence. So I'm getting kind of like excited and rambly here. This is all very interesting. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, but I personally don't know exactly where I fall on this spectrum. I probably lean a little bit more tech just because I do find myself getting excited about things like the Apple Vision Pro. But I do want to caveat that by saying it does feel like we currently live in an age where technology is advancing faster than we as a society are able to keep up with it, and to
Right.
properly assess its safety and to put up proper guardrails or even to hit the brakes and ask the right questions. We are failing to do that in many ways. And that does worry me a little bit in an existential way. I don't know. It's a big question. I am curious what you think, though. Where do you think you fall on that spectrum of no tech, all tech, and the nuance in between?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely I think if I'm just cutting to the chase, like I know that I fall more on the side of believing or at least hoping that technology will solve most of our problems, you know.
Yeah,
Maybe not
yeah,
all of
yeah.
them. We still need to, I think, as a species, as people, individually, culturally, collectively, and separately, we still need to define meaning for our own lives and for what moves us, you know, personally and then as a collective species. And I think there are, of course, some things that we more or less universally share. Like, I think we all hopefully believe that life is good and promoting life is a good thing. And
Mm-hmm.
ideally,
Mm-hmm.
we would do it sustainably. And I think the sustainability is the kind of open question. Like,
Right.
when you look at what we're doing now, it's hard to say that what we're doing is sustainable. And therefore, yeah, it's possible we will totally we'll let the tech outpace us. You know, we'll maybe it's that there's new existential risks that are posed by things like AI that we haven't properly contained, or maybe it's that we will have just used up all of the resources, as Pan Han kind of describes,
Yeah.
and basically leave the planet uninhabitable. But
I haven't turned off my Bitcoining PC in 10 years. My Bitcoin mining
that's right.
PC is churning through those fossil fuels. My
I mean,
server
it's
farm
funding
over
this
there.
whole operation. That's right. Yeah. So it's interesting thinking about it. You know, like yeah, you know, as you know, I read Kim Stanley Robinson's New York 2140 last year,
Yes.
and it was interesting because I think the remarkable thing, or maybe unremarkable thing, is we're in this time when climate change has totally ravaged the planet. I mean, there have been massive floods. New York is meters underwater, and what do you find?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We adapt. Yes, the streets are totally submerged, but we just pivot to flying boats and mega high
Cool.
rises instead. And you can interpret that as the resilience of humanity. But maybe the lesson is technology can't solve all our problems, you know?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think I instinctively find myself in the camp of believing and hoping that as we advance and we put our heads together on the problems that we face collectively, that we'll find solutions. But you know, maybe the lesson in these chapters is at least challenge that notion a little bit. Maybe that's an overly optimistic perspective.
Totally. Totally. I think you and I actually probably fall in a similar place on that spectrum of
Yeah.
technology to no technology. And I'm hopeful that we will find the solutions that we need to as we get there. But I really do like how this book is sort of challenging my notions that maybe the iPhone 16 won't solve my depression. And I perhaps need to find a different solution.
Maybe a fruit roll up or two, you know, just go back to the natural
Right,
ways.
right. The natural ways: dip an Oreo in milk and eat it. And that,
Exactly.
as
You
humans
know,
have been doing since the Stone Age.
that's right. Maybe
Uh,
40 ounces of flaming hot Cheetos, you know? Who's to say?
Honestly, though, that just might do the trick. I love Flamin' Hot Cheetos. Okay, well, while we are on the topic of giant existential questions, there is another one that we have to discuss from this book. Let's talk about this concept of the shooter and the farmer.
This is a great one.
Yeah.
I'm so curious what you think about this. How did it come off for you? This is, I don't know. This is just an interesting section.
It's so fascinating. I mean, I immediately I could not have highlighted this section faster on my Kindle. I was like,
Yeah.
all of this, print it,
Yes.
frame it, put it up on the wall.
Yes.
Okay, super interesting. So as we've established in these chapters, the frontier of science, their stated mission, their goal is to determine the bounds of science, to find the edge and see
Right.
if we can't cross it anymore, right? Where's the edge of our understanding? And the metaphors of the shooter and the farmer, what they're sort of illustrating is that perception and reality are not one-to-one. And
Right.
man, this opens up a massive can of worms, because there's many theories out there about our understanding of reality and whether it's impossible for us to know what a true reality is, because we all perceive it differently. And
Right.
both on an individual scale from person to person, but then on a collective human scale as far as our human knowledge and understanding in science goes. And the frontier of science in this book seemingly is implying that there is a wall, that we will hit a wall of knowledge that we cannot science ourselves past, and we will not be able to understand anything beyond that.
Right.
And it's super fascinating, because I don't know. I don't think I agree. Do you? Did you look at these metaphors and go, yeah, totally, we're going to hit a wall of knowledge?
Yeah, I don't know that I'm totally sold on that as much, but I guess it's there isn't an element there that does resonate with my personal picture of the world, which is
Okay.
that at the moment, for example, our best science, our best physics gives us two competing theories of reality. If you go down the route of classical Newtonian mechanics, you've got one picture of the world and it makes sense, and we can predict things about the motion of planets and how forces affect physical objects and all of those sorts of things. And then
Right.
down another angle, you've got all that quantum mechanics business, which I have no understanding or knowledge of.
Yeah.
But I know that however far that hole goes, we haven't been able to reconcile those two pictures. We can't quite reconcile, Einstein's relativity and all of that business with quantum mechanics, and so yeah, there is something there that to me feels not necessarily like we've reached a limit, or that there's a point of no return where we can no longer answer the big questions. But I do think maybe it is more complex than our ability to represent. Maybe
Right.
the best, because ultimately you have to be able to describe these things in language, whether it's English or math or whatever the other thing might be. And maybe there's a limit there to where we can't totally articulate an actually accurate picture of the world. And for me, I don't necessarily find that so unsettling. But of course, we saw in some of
Really?
these chapters that differs for people. I know it does, and I personally, I'm okay with a little bit of that mystery.
Wow. Interesting. Bold take. I think we fall in different camps when it comes to that. I do want to point out, though, you made a really great point that it may not necessarily even be that we hit a wall of knowledge and can't go any further, but it might just be that the nature of reality itself is so complex that we don't have the language, the tools, the math to actually articulate it properly.
Right.
And Wang Mao
Right.
actually scratches at this idea in today's reading too, because he says, quote, "Can the fundamental nature of matter really be lawlessness? Can the stability and order of the world be but a temporary dynamic equilibrium achieved in a corner of the universe, a short-lived eddy in a chaotic current?" End quote.
Right. Right.
Is the universe just so complex and so chaotic that we'll just never explain it properly?
Right. Right.
Very big
Huge question.
existential question. Huge question. I do want to say, I myself am not sold on this shooter farmer metaphor entirely.
Yeah.
I understand it conceptually. And I get what the frontiers of science, I suppose, is trying to get at here. But I will say personally, I was raised Muslim. I'm not a very religious person anymore, though. But I do find myself aligning a lot with the philosophy of deism, or at least sort of the thought exercise of deism.
Yeah.
Where the basic principles, from my understanding, the basic principles of deist thought is that a higher power or a higher being does exist, but also that power doesn't directly intervene in our day-to-day lives and honestly probably doesn't care.
Right.
I definitely find myself aligning with that thinking, where I do believe in a higher power, but I also don't believe that higher power is going to get me a raise next year.
Right. Not next year. Maybe the year after.
Maybe the year after. Maybe I need to just pray harder. I'm not praying hard enough.
Just 1 year longer.
Another facet of deism that I do find myself strongly aligning with, though, is that the philosophy really emphasizes the idea that rational thought and observation and logic and empirical data gathering, all of that is sufficient in understanding the nature of reality and also in proving the existence of God. And so that would put me in opposition to the frontiers of science, because their platform is like, we're going to find the edge. There's an edge of science. There's an edge of our ability to articulate science and reality. I don't think there is an edge. I think we can continue to grow and evolve and learn as a species and find greater and greater truths. Whether we live in a simulation or whether we were created by these godlike alien beings out there, or whether we are just like a 1 in a trillion cosmic mishap of nature, I do think we are capable of uncovering that and figuring out the larger than life questions. So I don't know. That's kind of where I fall on that perspective. And I think the idea that we won't figure it out is actually quite scary to me. You seem quite comfortable with there are big unanswered questions and we'll never know. Who cares? I am more like, no, we like I care. I'm the one that cares. And like I really need us to figure this out as a species.
Yeah. I agree. That's somewhere that we probably diverge, actually. I do appreciate these chapters for forcing us to have this discussion and to like raise these questions,
Totally.
Because you don't, you think about them at times, not so often, but it is like, there's obviously a lot going on in media in the last decade or so around the metaverse, or not necessarily the metaverse so much as like the multiverse. And between the multiverse and things like simulation theory, there is this kind of open question around how much of the fundamental nature of reality do we understand?
Yeah. I do have a question for you as we wrap up our discussion. You mentioned earlier that like these are things that we don't think about often, we think about on occasion, right? Big existential questions. Can you define occasion for me? How often would you say you're thinking about the existential nature of our reality? Just trying to gauge where like I should be falling, How often is too often?
That's right. Listen, I never inhaled, but I would say occasionally, at the odd party or two, a meeting of colleagues and friends, but never inhaled,
Great. Okay. So you would probably say like laying awake every other night thinking about this, perfectly normal, perfectly fine.
Totally normal. That's
Oh no, what is reality? Okay, well, what a great conversation. This was so much fun, Obsa, and I can't wait to see what other big ideas we get to talk about in this book. But that wraps up our episode for today and the discussions on chapters 4 through 6. Dear listener, we do have homework for you.
That's right.
Because for the next episode, make sure that you have read chapters 7 through 14. This is a bigger chunk of the book. Make sure you have completed the reading before checking out the next episode. And as always, if you want to stay on top of the reading, you can check out our entire season's schedule in the show notes. So take a peek, make sure you've done the reading, and share your thoughts with us as you read along.
And friends, that's a wrap. That's the end of our episode.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for joining us. This was a really fun one to do, Abu.
Yeah.
And you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. Oh wait, you can. If you want to continue the discussion, join us on Discord and Patreon, where we've got some more morsels for you to chew on and a nerddom waiting for you to join.
Yes.
And of course, please do leave us reviews on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Check out the other shows on the Lore Party Podcast Network on loreparty.com. You can also, of course, find us on Twitter and Instagram at lore_party. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, while the fundamental nature of matter may be lawlessness and the stability and order of the world, but a temporary dynamic equilibrium achieved in a corner of the universe, a short-lived eddy in a chaotic current, we'll be here to discuss it.
Indeed we will. Indeed we will. I'm never getting to sleep tonight, that's for sure.
Who needs sleep when you've got these juicy, juicy morsels to chew on?
What is sleep, right?